So the talk is about technology, and it's so this is you right now. You're looking at Zoom, and you've probably done this many times over the last year and a half, fortunately or unfortunately. And so it is clear that we are in a different age now than we were maybe compared to when you were a student. Many things have remained the same, but many things have clearly changed. Technologies like cloud computing, cryptocurrency, just the way we use the internet, the way we do teleconferencing, the way we network, everything has changed. And it's very important right now to try to understand what the implications are of these changes for the way the students' minds will be changing. And just to give a brief overview of some indices of the technological change. So this is in Singapore. You see at the bottom are the telephone subscriptions, so fixed landlines. And you see that they've been increasing over the 20th century, but they kind of peaked a while ago. But it's really the mobile subscriptions that have been skyrocketing. So now there are 140 mobile subscriptions for every 100 people in Singapore. And it seems to have maybe plateaued. I don't know what the sudden drop is around 2010, but it's plateaued around 140, 150. So it's really mobile use that has been the driver of the change in the way we use technology. And so if you look at it by age group, it's kind of what you might expect. It's age 15 to 24, this young age group that has a 100% adoption since 2018. All groups are rising, and it's especially actually age 75 and over. This is a striking plot too. So it used to be only 11% just in 2016. And in the span of 4 years, usage increased by sixfold to 60%. And so probably higher now. And so across all age groups, so it's really become a ubiquitous technology, the use of smartphones and the apps that are in them and the way we connect to other people through these apps. It's not just the devices that we hold in our hands, the way the economy works is different too. So if you interview kids now, I bet that even in your schools, you'll find that if you ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? Maybe 20 years ago, people would have said a lawyer, a doctor, engineer, something like this. Now, a lot of people will say a YouTube influencer or maybe an esports star, because look at the amount of money that these people are making. So many of these are kids, and they make tens of millions of dollars per year if they are a top YouTube broadcaster, or they can make millions of dollars per year playing video games if they're very good. This is a talent that was maybe hidden in the past, but now that this is such a big thing, the kind of distribution of skill is more salient. And so some people are geniuses who get paid money to play video games, and which is a very tough industry, by the way. So there are some people who have died while playing video games from being on the seat too much. And so, of course, with all this rapid change, there's also a moral dimension or a kind of affective dimension, where we don't know what's going to happen. And there's this worry about what technology is going to do to not only us, but also to our kids who are in a very early stage of life where they are absorbing many things in their environment. And so it's not a new thing. You can see that this time cover is the worry is we have it contemporaneously too, but with all the wires, you can see that people were worrying about this 20 years ago already. So I think you can empathize with me when I say that it's really unclear what the effects of all this technology, all this screen time is going to be on our kids' minds and brains. But actually, this kind of, moral panic might be overblowing it a bit, but when you see it applied to other technologies, then actually panic feels like a correct word, because in 1924, a British newspaper put out this column where they described the phenomenon of crossword puzzles proliferating in the United States. And they kind of portrayed it in this way, where they called it enslaved America. So they're saying the Americans are now obsessed with crossword puzzles, and that is really messing with their minds. And there was a real worry back in the day. Same for radio. So this is an article from 1935. So they are saying that radio is invading the privacy of our homes. So now this might seem like an absurd statement, because we are in an age where we are happy to have speakers in our homes that record what we say and listen to our voices, and cameras as well. But back in the 1930s, just the fact of having a radio that emits sound that is broadcasted was an invasion of privacy, and that will fundamentally change the way we live our lives. Go back even further, just literacy itself, something that is, of course, you teach this in schools, not only in English class. Writing is an essential part of every aspect of education. But when writing was first emerging in Greek society, philosophers like Plato, citing Socrates, said things like this: if men learn this, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls. They will cease to exercise memory because they will rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks. And as men filled, not with wisdom, but with the conceit of wisdom, they will be a burden to their fellows. So this passage represents a serious worry at the time that writing was going to degrade not only people's minds, but also the organization of society as a whole. And again, the technology is very different, but the worry is very familiar. And it is not necessarily just an overblown worry, because it is true that writing really changes the mind. We don't really know how much literacy changes the mind because you have probably only met people who are literate. So you have really no comparison group. But if you go back to Siberia in the USSR in the mid 20th century, we can see it through the eyes of Alexander Luria, who was a Russian psychologist. He interviewed villagers in one of these Siberian villages, where some of the villagers had literacy and some of the villagers had never learned how to read. And so when you interview these villagers who never learned how to read and try to understand the way their minds work, you find that it's very different from the way our minds work. So for example, Luria asks this, he poses this logical syllogism. All bears are white where there is always snow. In Novaya Zemlya, there's always snow. What color are the bears there? So this is a classic syllogism, right? With two tenets and a conclusion. And so this is the kind of things that is taught in a critical thinking class. But the villager answers, I have seen only black bears and I do not talk of what I have not seen. But what do my words imply? If a person has not been there, he cannot say anything on the basis of words. If a man was 60 or 80 and has seen a white bear there and told me about it, he could be believed. You can almost hear the frustration in his words that this statement makes no sense. And so this kind of abstract thinking, at least Luria proposes, is a function of the acquisition of reading. So he asks another villager, what do a chicken and dog have in common? He answers, they are not alike. A chicken has 2 legs, a dog has 4. A chicken has wings, but a dog doesn't. A dog has big ears and the chickens are small. So he just enumerates the differences. Then Luria asks, is there one word you could use for them both? No, of course not. Would the word animal fit? Yes. So he understands the word animal, but this abstract category is not intuitive for this villager. So for us, animal seems like a natural part of the world. So it seems like even in the absence of humans, there would still be animals. But actually, this is an abstract category. And it's not obvious to someone who has never thought this way that a chicken and a caterpillar and a dog all belong to the same category. So the fact that we use these very abstract categories that subsume many different things with different appearances, this might also be a function of acquisition of reading. And if we look in the brain, we do indeed see that there are differences in the way brains work, depending on whether the person is someone who can read or who cannot read. So in these 3 plots, the horizontal axis is the words that the person can read per minute. And so the colors represent whether the person is illiterate, X-illiterate, meaning they learn to read later in life, or normally literate. And so there's this one area in the left hemisphere of your brain, kind of behind your left ear, called the visual word form area. And this area is more heavily activated in people who can read when they are looking at text. And this sort of makes sense because this area is an area of the neocortex that responds to these fine-grained figures, which you find on the pages of a book. And so you do see this relationship. But at the same time, it's very interesting because by learning how to read, you're also foregoing other abilities. So for example, in people who can read less or who cannot read, the same area, the VWFA, is activated more for faces. So when you're looking at faces and text seem like very different things, but to the retina of your eye, they're similar in some way. because what you're doing is fine-grained discrimination of kind of proportions and ratio of subtle shapes. So lowercase b, lowercase p, or uppercase O and uppercase Q. So these things are, the difference is obvious to you, but that's because you've spent decades learning this distinction. But for someone who has not come across these symbols, the distinction is very fine-grained, and same for faces. You're very used to seeing faces, but actually the face of one person another, it's really distinguished by very small differences in the proportion of the configuration of their eyes and nose and such. And so moreover, now imagine that imagine if someone grew up on a deserted island and never saw any faces. So you can predict that this area would maybe not be responding to faces, and it'd be responding to something else on their island that is relatively fine-grained and requires subtle discrimination of visual form. So this is just also an illustration of a principle called cortical plasticity or malleability, which just is a way of saying that the brain changes a lot. So it's not a fixed thing that is determined by your genes. The brain really changes its function and the way its relationship to the environment based on your experience and what you learned over life. One example of something that can change your brain is an abacus. So this is an ancient technology, but it is still shaping the brains of the youth today, maybe less so than in the past. But once you learn the abacus, of course, you can do calculations much faster than with just a pure mental arithmetic. But actually, once you learn the abacus, you internalize it. And even in the absence of the instrument, you are still able to do the calculation with the rapid speed. So when you look at these Iranian students in the mathematics contest, where they're doing mental arithmetic, so the top performers are the ones who can manipulate an invisible abacus and do the calculations as if the device were in front of their eyes. And so an abacus is an obvious object. It's a physical instrument, but there are probably many things that are shaping your minds and brains in a similar way that are not as concrete because they do not hold them in front of you. Whether your society has engaged in agriculture and what kind of agriculture, whether you're living in an urban or a rural environment, whether you are in an exchange economy where you exchange goods and services for money, and whether you do this just among your kin or with anonymous others. So of course, all of these are variables that vary greatly even within the world today and across history as well. There's a lot of anthropological evidence showing that each of these things shapes our minds in profound ways. We don't really realize it because we tend to share these traits with people in our own society, of course. I probably won't have a neighbor who has never used money or who has never lived in a city. And so we just do not see this variation, but it certainly exists today and for sure across history. And in that sense, our brains are very anomalous. And of course, the topic of today is education. Just think of how much time children's brains are spent floating in a classroom on a head, which sits on a chair, and the kind of information that it is getting. This seems normal because everybody does this today. Our parents went through the same kind of classroom, but it is a relatively new invention, a modern education. Before this, there were more apprenticeship-like systems. And in the past, it was not formal schooling at all. Just kind of kids would hang around their hunter parents and their friends and just learn by observation. And so it is very clear that this, at least as a prediction, that this must have shaped our brains.